it's a pleasure to be with Edward St. Aubyn to discuss and annotate somewhat his extraordinary new novel, Double Blind, which is just out from FSG. I am one of those writers who basically feels, as I was saying to Mr. St. Aubyn just yesterday, who basically feels that the necessary work of writing can be accomplished by one writer for an entire generation. We don't need too many others. But the truth is that I am incapable of reading Edward St. Aubyn's writing without perpetual gasps of astonishment and admiration at the craft of his sentences. Writing, in my view, and I take a narrowly Nabokovian view of this subject, is sentences, structure, and style, and everything else belongs in newspaper editorials. As a stylist, there is simply no one alive writing English right now who I feel can begin to compare with Edward St. Aubyn. And what I wanted to do just quickly before we begin our conversation is just to pick out a few of the moments that made me shiver with wonder as I was working my way through his novel. And particularly because, and I think this is the thing that makes his writing so extraordinary, we normally think of wit as being a sequence of apothegms and aphorisms, often touched more by abusive malice than by penetration. And the kind of wit that Teddy St. Aubyn has is a generous, humane, and descriptive in its tone, as often as it is satiric. Here's a brief passage about a train ride. Thrilled and apprehensive about being on her way to spend the weekend with her new lover, she, character named Olivia, character I have fondness for because my daughter is as well. She stared out of the train window at the stammering suburbs, the football fields, the back gardens, the industrial estates, the little patches of wood aspiring to rural life, some bulbous silver graffiti on a brick wall, the double speed and double clatter and sudden intimacy of a train passing in the opposite direction. It looked as if London would ramble on until it finally had to be drowned in the sea. I don't know of a more perfect description of the experience of taking a train out of London. But this is a book that devotes itself in large part to questions of science, and particularly to questions of genetics. And it does include a satiric thrust, a beautifully malicious moment or two. As for instance, when we read about one Professor Moorhead, who seems to be a transparent cover for a more familiar genetic fundamentalist, we read of him, since Moorhead assumed that human nature was entirely mechanical, as he explained with an irresistible combination of smugness and impatience in his masterwork, The Insatiable Machine, she, the student, Olivia again, had assumed that his advances could be mechanically rebuffed. But this particular machine seemed to have a mind of its own, or at least someone else's mind programmed into it, since it wasn't, strictly speaking, entitled to one of its own. Which seems to me as fair. I could go on, and I should, in fact, but just quickly, this is a sentence that I have been sending around to wine-loving friends. Our characters find themselves in a wine bar in London, and when she looked at her phone, Francis and Olivia expected her, character named Lucy, to embark on reading the hilarious list of random objects: blackcurrant leaves, saddles, long notes, cigars, and ripe cherries that make wine prose into a cryptic branch of literature that can only be deciphered by drinking the wine it fails to describe. I don't know of a more perfectly balanced and completely accurate sentence in recent writing. But I should add at once that all of that wit and descriptive acuity is the work of what in one time, in a more old-fashioned kind of literary criticism, was called a humane ambition. That sentence occurs actually just at the moment when the character, Lucy, is about to discover, and it's one of the main motive forces of the novel, that she is down, in fact, with a serious brain tumor that will certainly shorten and may indeed soon end her life. So the fabric of wit is woven into the life, the woof and warp of the novel, not at a decorative level, but deep within it, and necessarily so, if I may say, Teddy, because this is a novel of ideas, and part of the probity of writing a novel of ideas is to show that you have intellect enough to juggle them. And that is certainly the case here. It's not a satiric novel, it seems to me, in the usual sense of a novel that sets out to guy or mock somebody, but a true novel of ideas, in as much as it takes a set of overriding and in some ways, if not esoteric, then obscure, because technical concerns in the scientific world now, and applies them, explores them, investigates them, inquires into them in the context of actual existence, and particularly takes the question of what we might call, I suppose, genetic determinism, the ancient mind-body problem. What can we know about the materials of our bodies that enables us to understand the fundamental questions of mind and consciousness? And there are, and I can't resist one last reading where one of the characters thinks, space, instead of being a desolate interval between pinpricks of sentience, must be the conscious medium in which these more obvious forms of consciousness were concentrated. If matter was not inherently conscious, then one had to fall back on the official story that the pinpricks of sentience existed in an otherwise inanimate universe, thanks to a mind-numbingly long poker game in which the elements of the periodic table had been dealt out again and again until one bit of deadness haphazardly acquired the full house of life, and then only a few million hands later, the royal flush of consciousness. I don't know a more brilliantly rococo account of what is, in fact, the standard account of how consciousness emerges. All of those questions, how consciousness emerges, what genetics can tell us about our existence. The failure, which I think is extremely shrewdly observed, of the utopian hopes of genetics to explain everything as recently as 20 years ago, and their failure in what might replace them, all of those things are alive in this novel of ideas, along with a deeply felt and moving story of human love and attachment. That's what's involved, engaged in Double Blind, and I welcome Teddy St. Aubyn to New York virtually to discuss it. Teddy, it occurs to me the last time we were together, it was pre-pandemic, and I had just been soundly defeated in a debate which, with the allusion possible only to a New Yorker, I had imagined that I had won soundly, only to discover, in fact, that I had to retreat with my tail between my legs. We went off for dinner, and we had, as I recall, a bottle of Burgundy and a bottle of Bordeaux, in which I attempted to sop away my miseries. That was a pre-pandemic world, very different from the world that we've occupied for the past year. But perhaps we can begin that process of inebriation again on a higher literary level.
I long for that, and you did win the debate. Unfortunately, it was put to the vote, and a lot of people have been manipulated by your opponent, who behaved disgracefully. I long to see you in person again, and without bruising the skies too much or putting too big a carbon footprint on the world. I'd love to be in New York right now.
Wish we had you here. But let's talk. Reading this, I was struck by how much it exists within a tradition of the novel of ideas. And that's a very different thing, it seems to me, than a satiric novel or than a roman à clef. It's a novel where the ideas carry the action in large part. And it struck me, and I asked you this, it immediately reminded me of the novels now too often forgotten of Aldous Huxley, Chrome Yellow and Point Counterpoint. And I gather that that's not entirely alien to your making as a writer.
Yes, it's an extraordinary connection you made, which I hadn't thought about myself, but is true. And Aldous Huxley was the first writer, a serious writer, who I read very early in my life, when I was an early adolescent, and I was impressed by the fact that he lived in a port between the wars for part of the time, very near my house in France. And he'd lived there, and Thomas Mann had lived there, and lots of writers in exile had been in Sanaré-sur-Mer and Sybil Bedford. And so I started to read the work of these literary ghosts who occupied a port that I frequently visited, that I visited every week. And he had a big early influence on me, but one that I'd forgotten about. And it's very perceptive of you to make that connection. I think that's what I first thought a serious novel was, you know, arguments about ideas, as in point counterpoint between characters. But in Double Blind, I tried to integrate the ideas with the characters' lives, and not to make them talking heads, not to make them quite like the characters in Point Counterpoint, let alone like Thomas Love Peacock have a phrenologist called Mr. Cranium or something, you know, giving away the game like that. So apart from the fundamentalist geneticist you mentioned, William Moorhead, there are very few satirical characters. There's really William Moorhead and Cardinal Lagerfeld, who are sort of spiritual brothers in the sense that although they hate each other's opinions, they both share greed, irascibility, and dogmatism as characteristics. But they're minor characters. The other characters are fully involved emotionally with the scientific ideas that are discussed in the novel. Neuroimaging is addressed because Olivia wants to find out about her friend Lucy's neuroimages and her scans and what their status is and what they mean about her illness. And so everything is linked to the characters and to the lives in a way which I hope is integral and organic.
Completely. I was just searching this lovely section later on in which you make that plain. In fact, the brain tumor isn't just a symbol of the interpenetration of brain and mind. It is the fact of the interpenetration of brain and mind. When you have a brain tumor, you have something that is a physical object inside your brain, which nonetheless is entirely transforming your mind. So it works not so much as a metaphor, but as a physical instantiation of the principle of the book. And I think that's something that's extraordinarily successful.
And Lucy's trying to resist a physicalist, as it would be called, analysis of consciousness, in which the brain and the mind are identical, because in that case, you know, she has a tumor in her mind as well as her brain, which she doesn't, as she demonstrates.
Exactly. The one of the interesting and I think endlessly I don't know what to say, relevant, contemporary, pertinent arguments in the book is exactly the argument about genetic determinism and epigenetics. It's a very strong strand in the book's form for anyone who's just coming to this. It's the idea that for the first time, and you document it quite beautifully, in recent years, there's evidence for what used to be called a Lamarckian view of evolution. That is the idea that acquired traits can be passed on from mouse to mouse, or, you know, it's the legendary thing was always that the giraffe got a long neck by reaching up into the tops of trees, when in fact the whole Darwinian revolution was to say, no, the giraffe didn't get the long neck by reaching up. Giraffes accidentally acquired longer necks, which enabled them to reach to the top of trees, therefore outcompeting short-necked giraffes and passing them on to other people. But for the first time, and it's one of the fascinating things, and you document it quite eloquently in this book, there is counter evidence to that view.
That's right. There was a very important paper in Nature about these mice which were treated to a traditional Pavlovian experiment of being electrocuted while being exposed to a particular smell. And once they'd become what was called reliably fearful, the experiment was stopped, but the next generation of mice were inseminated without any contact, in case there was some kind of secret mouse communication about this
in
evil
a
spell.
double-blind experiment,
In
exactly.
a double-blind experiment, some female mice were inseminated with these reliably fearful mice's sperm, and then a new generation was born. And to everyone's astonishment, that generation, and indeed the one after, exhibited the same fear in the presence of that smell. And that is completely inexplicable in terms of neo-Darwinian genetics. There is no explanation in that framework by which the fear could have gone into the sperm of the mouse, and there was no means of communication. And so that was a puzzle, and nature took it seriously because it was a serious experiment. So it opens up, as you say, the world of inherited characteristics, which has also been noticed by psychologists, for instance, in Holocaust survivors' grandchildren seeming to be traumatized in some way, which is not explicable genetically, and so forth. So epigenetics are alive and exciting.
And matter crucially for your novel, just to make it, to explicate it for our listeners, because it represents a kind of the possibility, the avenue of a humane alternative to the notion of genetic fundamentalism, the idea that all we are mechanical creatures passing on as we're just meat bags designed to pass on genes from one meat bag to the next.
Or as Dawkins says in The Selfish Gene, we're lumbering robots who are carriers for our eternal genes. I mean, that's not even accurate within the framework of genetics, because people can have what's called de novo genes, which, as their name suggests, just spring up freshly. So then they're far from eternal, they're de novo. So it doesn't even make sense within a genetic description.
So I mentioned that we could go on discussing it because there's an incredibly rich fabric of ideas genuinely argued over and discussed, not brought in as embroidery or decoration, but central to the novel. I did want to ask you though, Teddy, I'm sure most of our listeners are familiar with or came to you through the Melrose novels and so on. At least superficially, this book seems to be a departure from the material of those books, which was more, what should we call it, Proustian with the kind of black mass version of Proust. Did you set out to write a novel of ideas as a self-conscious departure? I know all of us who are writers like to say, no, I never had any I just found myself writing it. But I wonder if you did feel that you wanted to climb Mount Huxley as much as you had previously climbed Mount Proust.
Well, I certainly wanted to escape from planet Melrose. So in a sense, this is the rocket I built to get off planet Melrose, because I'd mined out my own experience and my own past, and had lost interest in the themes brought up in the Melrose. I exhausted them over a long period. But I suppose the similarity between them is that they represent some kind of jailbreak, that I'm always writing to set myself free of something that I feel is trapping me. And in the Melroses, it was my family conditioning, and it was shame and addiction and class and all of the story,
abuse
and abuse and so forth. And this in this case, it's a more general affliction. It might be called the sort of materialist worldview and its discontents, and I felt trapped by that. I didn't want to climbed out of the well shaft into which I was thrown by my childhood, and be told that the sky, which I could finally see, was a sort of electrochemical shimmer inside my skull. I wanted it to be the sky, and so I started to look into arguments about consciousness and what it was. But there's also a longer thread in my work, which goes back to the mid-90s, when I wrote two books which are relatively obscure, On the Edge.
The pre-Melrose books.
Yeah, well, they were into Melrose. They were between the first three and the last two. And I was taking a break from the Melroses. I didn't even know I was taking a break. I thought when I'd written the first three that I was finished. And in those books, On the Edge and A Clue to the Exit, I started to be intrigued by some of the subjects which are explored in Double Blind. That was the seed that was planted. And I went to a conference in Tucson in 1996 called Towards the Science of Consciousness, and I was sort of puzzled and impressed by the fact that consciousness, which is the only thing we know we have and which is the basis of everything else we think we know, was not included in science's description of the world. And that troubled me right away. And I didn't want it to be reductionist. I didn't want to be, electrochemical activity inside my skull. I wanted the sky to be the sky. And and so it became another jail that I wanted to make a break from, I started to worry about whether other parts of science were afflicted by similar explanatory gaps, and read and explored that subject over a long period. And Double Blind is the result. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things, two things that immediately brings to mind. One is that you do an eloquent job of explaining what few people know, which is the cul-de-sac, if you like, of the genome research, right? There was an enormous promise that once we had mapped the genome, we would understand a huge range of behaviors, illnesses, and so on. And with the exception of a very few kind of monotonic ailments, in fact, we've learned nothing. We don't really understand why we are different from bonobo chimps or anything else. Yeah. by studying it. And that's kind of the existential space in which this novel takes place, is in the failure of one. Historically, when people look at it, the failure of one attempt to explain human behavior and the search for another.
Absolutely, the idea that there's a gene for a trait, is something which has been discredited, or at least it hasn't been proven at all over the last 21 years since the genome was mapped. And I drill down into that, particularly with a schizophrenic character who I have,
who plays an increasingly important role as the book goes on, and in fact is almost kind of a divine fool towards the end of the book.
Absolutely, yes. He goes into psychoanalysis where his schizophrenies and the language, which has always been treated as nonsense, is finally treated as a kind of code for the things that he can't express directly because they're too terrifying and upsetting. But the genetics of schizophrenia, which I looked into, are an example of the disappointment that you're talking about. And it turns out that when you sweep together all the correlations, of which there are 128 genes implicated in 108 loci, and many of the genes are correlated with many other diseases and so forth, that you get a 3.6% difference between between a schizophrenic and a control group. You know, you sweep together this pile of dust, you know, and it's tiny, you know. And so genetics are not an explanation. They have played a very useful role in this pandemic. And so if I wanted to endorse genetics, I should have viruses as the chief characters in my next novel, and one avian flu virus could meet another and fall in love and try and have a wedding in an industrial chicken farm or something like that.
Well, speaking of that, towards the end of the book, involved that very character Sebastian, there's and I assure our audience that this book was finished before the pandemic.
Absolutely, long finished.
There's an extraordinarily prescient passage here on page 232. Plagues were sweeping across the world. Ebola sweating blood out of West Africa. Rabid dogs roaming and foaming in India. Superbugs crawling up hospital walls. If you thought about it, thought Sebastian, the character we're discussing, hospitals were really for looking after germs, not people, to make sure that they learned how to survive all the antibiotics known to man. You were never going to get human beings who survived 100% of the insults thrown at them. But these superbugs were entering a realm of immortality. We were preparing them to be the gods of the next era, when humans were dinosaurs. The real point, though, like the tip of a syringe, like a syringe giving you a flu jab, was that this year there was a very nasty flu virus doing the rounds, and a lot of his workmates had been struck. They were bedridden now, with superbugs parachuting from the ceiling into their compromised immune systems.
It was strange when COVID struck, having written that, and you know, I wrote it as the kind of you know, rapid, associative, slightly paranoid mind that Sebastian has, and it
yes, it's a schizophrenic character is speculating in a somewhat paranoid way exactly what was about to strike the entire globe.
Yes, indeed, exactly. So yes, but in genetic terms, that's you know, the sequencing variants of COVID has been very successful. The sequence can then be emailed to a vaccine manufacturer who can tweak the vaccine. So at that level, it's very useful. But while I still have human protagonists, I'm not going to have their lives ruled by genetics. And I guess it was you know, I protest against all kinds of determinism, probably because of the jailbreak that the Melroses were, probably because you know, if I had accepted my conditioning, I would no longer be alive, and so I don't want to live in a world which is either psychologically or genetically determined. I want to live in a world in which we have a margin of freedom, and to explore what that means to the best of my ability.
Yes, it struck me actually that there's a direct line, different in some ways, though this Double Blind is from the Melrose books, in exactly that way. They're both protests against entrapment. They're human cries against being imprisoned, either in an abusive childhood, in the trap of genetic determinism. And they're searching for the tiny crack of light that might allow one to imagine a better way of life.
But you're right that there is a shift as well. I mean, there are those continuities, but there's a major shift in tone, I think, in Double Blind, which, and I'm going to be like one of those writers that you alluded to earlier and say that I didn't set out to change the tone, because I don't actually have any plan in mind when I start writing. I do make things up as I go along, and so this book happened, and it had a much more sincere and compassionate, you know, and explicitly concerned tone. It's about people looking after each other. It's about friendship. It's about, trying to deal with people who are either physically or mentally damaged, or with an ecology which has been degraded. It's about people trying to look after the earth and each other, and that is a new tone in my work, and it's something that at the end of At Last, Patrick Melrose wonders whether he can ever give up irony, the hardest addiction of all. The hedging of his bets, the saying one thing and meaning another, being in two places at once. And I think this book is written in the space that he was wondering whether he would ever be able to occupy. The one that is beyond irony. Not that there isn't irony within it, yes, in detail, but it's not, as it were, structurally ironic. It's not.
Well, the very idea of a book about the mind-body problem that turns on the presence of a brain tumor is intrinsically ironic, because the tumor is. But there's a beautiful passage that I think exemplifies towards the end of the book exactly that new power, and I won't hesitate to call it compassion, and it even touches in the best imaginable sense on the verge of sentiment when Lucy is reflecting on her own illness, and she says, reflects, and yet although she would be embarking on an immunotherapy trial at the same time as her best friend was embarking on motherhood, she still felt immensely lucky to be surrounded by so much love. She was also encouraged as a patient to be living at a time when oncology might be about to enter a revolutionary change, rather than just make incremental refinements to its old attacks on the emperor of all maladies, as the famous oncologist Siddhartha Mukherjee had called it. Whether a revolution was about to occur or not, she must, as she had often discussed with Francis, her lover, resist the lure of optimism as much as the lure of terror, and rest in not knowing, as he put it. Amazingly enough, that was what she was doing now, looking out of Hunter's windows at the darkening park, perhaps more at ease than she had ever been, not just with her tumor, but with being alive. I think that's an extraordinary paragraph, unexpected, coming at us with a shock not of cruelty or irony, but with compassion and true feeling. I don't know a more beautiful sentence than that: resist the lure of optimism as much as the lure of terror, and rest in not knowing.
Yes, and that is where we leave Lucy psychologically. But it's also in a more general way what we need to do about some of this contested territory that the novel's exploring. Can we rest in not knowing? Do we have to be so virulently opinionated or so tribal, to use a fashionable word? Can we just rest in not knowing and also have the experience the vertigo of not knowing in the face of a lot of unsatisfactory explanations
for the deep things. I do want to come back and talk a bit, if we can, about the pandemic, because obviously escaping the pandemic, as we seem to be, knock wood, is on everyone's mind. As you mentioned, there's a very persuasive case made in the first, particularly in the novel's first pages, for wilding, for simply rejecting the technological civilization, in some ways scientific civilization, and returning to a more, more ecological, sustainable, natural, Rousseauian state. And I think that certainly all of us right now are poised in a state of uncertainty and not knowing about what comes next. If the pandemic is the lever, the pointer that pushes us towards some form of planetary reform, or if it's simply a blip on our screen that will return us to exactly the same things and preoccupations we were undergoing before. I think we have one point of view from here in New York, but I suspect somewhat different one from London. I'd love you to inform us a bit about how you see it and how you feel it's seen more broadly in England.
Yes, I think at a very banal level, I think pandemic preparedness is certainly going to stay with us after this. But there are probably deeper changes as well. I hope so. And it could go either way. But it seems as if the kind of populist nationalist leaders who belittled the pandemic are suffering for it. That, you know, Bolsonaro is trailing Lula in Brazil, and that
Modi in India seems to be.
Modi is not. Yes, the Congress Party are back in India, etc. And there are ecological consequences to that. And you know, America's rejoined the Paris Agreement. You know, if Lula does get elected, there'll be less of a slash and burn attitude to Amazonia, um, and 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 so forth. So I think there is a link between the pandemic and ecology. And there's another link, which is that the pandemics are going to come, as far as we know, unless they're deliberately disseminated. They're going to come from zoonotic diseases. They're going to come from the friction between the wild world and the human world.
And the erosion of space between those two worlds.
And the erosion of space, and everything which is bad for the planet, like deforestation, is also conducive to pandemic, because roads are built into forests, and hunters who hunt for wild meat will have more contact with wild animals. And that's how HIV came into the world. It's now been traced back to the First World War, when the Allied forces were trying to reconquer a German colony in West Africa, and sent a lot of hunters out who'd always hesitated to kill chimpanzees because the chimpanzees were so well organized and aggressive. But once there were enough hunters and enough guns, they killed chimpanzees. And when they butchered them, HIV went into the bloodstream of humans for the first time. And that patient zero was one of the hunters at that point. And so this will happen again and again. I think also in terms of the themes in the book, and also just of our lives in general, that you know, a bat in a wet market in Wuhan dominating 2 years of human history, you know, is about as vivid a proof of interconnectedness as we could possibly want. If you don't think things are interconnected, then, you know,
bat bites a pangolin somewhere in Wuhan, and we all take to our beds.
So I think, and also if work patterns change and office space is released, then it could turn into residential space, or into hydroponic, you know, urban farms. You know, there are all sorts of possibilities that open up as a result of this pandemic, and I don't think we're going to be able to just steamroll these events and return to the status ante. And I think I hope we won't. And the very fact that you and I are talking now, and that I didn't fly to New York, will make what was a famous poster in England during the war return to our minds, which was, "Is your journey really necessary?" You know, there was a poster all over every train station in England, because they didn't want to waste fuel, and they didn't want to waste anything during the war. And so that was the question: is your journey really necessary?
And the answer seems to be not really. There's very little.
Not really, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Before, I know we have lots of questions from the audience, and I want to turn to them. But I realize, as we've been talking, that I have entrapped you in an irony, if not a paradox, which is, I said at the beginning, speaking about your book, that sentences, style, and structure, the Nabokovian faith, were everything. But I find that we're actually talking about the editorial content. for the most part. But I'd love it if you would say if something. I know that it's like talking about how you make love to your partner is talking about how you go about writing a book, but how you feel about the writer's role, and if there's anything to be said about it, about the role of wit in novel writing.
Well, it's funny you should mention Nabokov, because he's an obvious hero, but he's one of them, and so is Proust, and so is Henry James, and so is Flaubert, and le style c'est tout. You know, I belong to the group of what Barthes called writerly writers, you know, who are about the sentence, are about what Nabokov called aesthetic bliss. And I don't, it's an aspiration, you know, it's not something that I'm claiming to have achieved, but that is what drives me. And I am very concerned with the sentence and the flow of sentences at an aesthetic level. And I think that probably has its roots in the fact that I was very dyslexic as a child and very troubled, and I had to actually follow the words with my finger because otherwise they dropped off the page. And so I read very slowly. And the question of how a sentence sounds, if you like, of the eloquence of a sentence, was something that I absorbed as a result of what was really a disability. And that's why I write very slowly. I rewrite everything I write very often, and that's my process. I mean, as to wit, I don't know if I have anything especially to say about wit. It's just trying to make sentences luminous is going to drag wit into the process at some point. But it's a byproduct of wanting to bring more light into my understanding of the world. You know, I never write about things that I've understood or that I want to tell people about. I write about things that trouble me and that I may very well not want to tell anyone about. Like Nevermind, my first novel, was about the thing I most wanted to keep secret. And I didn't write this book because I was confident of my opinions on these subjects of genetics, etc. But because I wanted to explore them and to find out what was true as far as I could.
When I say wit, I mean it not just in terms of aphoristic depth charges, but in the much broader texture of the novel being wrought in that way, being fully worked exactly in the tradition of James and Flaubert. Before we go to our questions, let me ask you one other more, I hope not unforgivably mundane question. The Melrose novels were an enormous success, a well-deserved success, but they made noise in the world. They produced, I think, a very fine television series and so on. Was there any recovery process for you, process of surprise and reevaluation in dealing with having become that kind of, if you like, a public figure, someone so widely celebrated for a particular work of a fiction or a series of things?
Well, it was so agonizingly slow that I had plenty of time to adjust. I had 15
years. was slow growing.
15 years of total obscurity, and then a gradual emergence. So I think it would have been very difficult if Nevermind had been a sort of global success when I was relatively young and so forth. And that's not what happened to me. I was quite grown up by the time more than 300 people had read anything I'd written. And so it was more a question what I said earlier of wanting to build a rocket to escape from planet Melrose. I was very pleased that it was appreciated, and I thought that the television production was brilliant, and I was very grateful for the recognition. But then I didn't want to be, you know, fully and solely identified with this story, which had such a high autobiographical content. Double Blind is not any more sincere and moving in tone, or you know, but also it has no protagonist who's an alter ego. You know, it's an ensemble piece. You know, it has lots of equally weighted characters. It's more of a community rather than this very salient protagonist that Patrick Melrose is.
Well, on that point, one of our listeners, Judy, asks, how did you decide to have female main characters in this particular novel?
I didn't sort of. I really can't emphasize enough how much I make things up as I go along. You know, I didn't make a decision. Characters turn up. I decided to write about friendship and also about love, and so Francis, the rewilding ecologist, you know, falls in love with Olivia, so she turned up that way. In fact, originally she was in the first chapter. The chapter order was changed, so I'd started out with Olivia, and I didn't. Father Guido is a character who
with a wink to our Father Guido, or not? I wasn't certain.
No, I didn't know about your Father Guido until after I'd written Father Guido. But he's perhaps the most for me surprising example of a character turning up. He's a Franciscan abbot. I've never met a Franciscan abbot. I've never written about one, but he just took over one of the chapters,
and he also provokes a wonderful, and in one of the genuinely satiric sections of the novel, a cardinal, a beautifully cynical cardinal, who says, if he fails to sign this agreement to commercialize his work, we will tie up this predator in red tape for decades to come in every country in the world. Not only do we have 2,000 years of experience with red tape, he added, standing beneath a sumptuous tapestry, but ours is drenched in the blood of Christ.
Yes, that's right. He sends Father Guido on a mission to go to a party given by a venture capitalist. Anyway.
Someone else asks, Nitsan Leibovich, I think, many thanks for your remarkable writing. I found great comfort in it. In a previous interview, this speaks to one of the questions we were exploring. You said that the hardest part of writing for you was the metaphors part. How was engaging with scientific metaphors and storage of images in this book?
Yes, well, did I say that in a previous interview? I'm surprised if I did. I can never remember what I say in interviews because
I think it was actually Margaret Atwood who said that in a previous interview. So we'll move right along to.
I think for actually there's similes just appear in my imagination. There are some things that are given, you know, to me in the sense that dialogue. It's like eavesdropping sometimes, and a simile is just a picture I have in my mind and have to transcribe. The really hard stuff is writing the descriptive narrative, not the dialogue, but just describing things and moving the plot forward as fully but as rapidly as possible. That's what I find. That's the hard work. But scientific metaphors is a very interesting subject, and a vast subject, really. I think that metaphors um, are needed by, Richard Lowenton said that metaphors were needed by scientists, but as a tool for exploring the subject of inquiry, because almost everything that science is interested in is not accessible directly to our senses, you know, whether it's a Higgs boson or an RNA, an mRNA, you know, or the expanding edge of the universe, you know, we can't see them with our naked eyes. So we need to work with metaphor as a tool, or scientists need to work with metaphor as a tool. I also think it's interesting in the way that metaphors are, you know, used to explain the deepest mysteries of human existence. By reference to our latest artifact. You know, in the 18th century, the universe was a clock.
It was the clock.
And now we're being invited to believe that the mind is a computer, and you know,
after having been invited to believe the mind was like a telephone switchboard.
It was a telephone switchboard. Now it's become a computer, because we've got computers, and the brain is the hard wiring, and the display on the screen is the mind, and it's all perfectly explicable. If you so either you can believe that that's just the easiest and most fashionable and laziest metaphor you can come up with, or you can believe that hundreds of thousands of years of evolution have led to this moment where we can finally see our own minds in the mirror of our computer screen. I leave you to decide, you know.
Yes, exactly. No, it's also true, you know, someone once said, you know, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But it's equally true that if you only have one kind of hammer, I won't try and finish that aphorism because I'm not sure where it was headed. But I will say that it's certainly true about Darwin. I wrote a book about Darwin once, and one of the things that's fascinating about Darwin is that the key moment is exactly for him when he's back from the Galapagos, and he's kind of drunk on his own observations, and he suddenly sees, he does a kind of rabbit duck foreground background switch, that the species is not the fixed thing, it's the variations that is the significant thing. It's not that the species is fixed in the center with the variations to the side. The variations are the significant thing with the species, the moving one. Oh, and Nietzsche tells us that your remark about metaphor was in an interview to Michael Silverblatt with KCRW, and I'm sure that's true. Let me see. I want to make sure that I'm.
Oh well, I'm sorry. Okay. I did. I'm sorry.
I will add only that authors are not responsible for the things they say in interviews, because generally speaking, the worst interviews, I don't know if you've done these, are in France, where the question goes on for about 20 minutes, and you get to assent or negate the yes, exactly, the interpretation. What are you working on now? We're running out of time, but I'd love to know what, I'm sure our listeners would love to know what you're working on next.
Well, during the sound check earlier in the day, I said I'm a techno moron with long COVID, and it's midnight in London. And so you said that sounds like a title of an Edward Stolpin novel. So I've decided that is the title of my next novel. So so there you have it. I think I don't know. I'm not actually working on anything because I have got long COVID, and I am. I had not wanted
to mention that, not to invade your.
I've been I've got about 2 or 3 good hours in the day, but until 2 weeks ago, I had 5 months of absolutely seamless exhaustion, despair, and brain fog.
I wish given your gifts, I wish you would write something that would describe for the rest of us what the experience of brain fog is, because it's clearly a new ailment in the world. It's like, hypochondria in the 17th century, or melancholia or something. One hears about it, but it's hard for the very privileged and lucky non-sufferer to grasp entirely what it is.
Well, you've given me my mission, and as it's implied by the now public title of my next novel, I'm a techno-moron with long COVID, and
Okay.
it's midnight in London.
Okay.
I will describe brain fog maybe like a bleak house. Maybe instead of starting with actual fog, we can start with mental fog.
Well, that, you know, I for some of our listeners, I did a lecture on Dickens for the 92nd CY, which ended with Bleak House for exactly that reason, with the first paragraphs of Bleak House as the climax of English prose, which I often think they are, and they have that marriage of unimaginably audacious image making with an enormously passionate and sincere moral purpose. So having ghettoized you with Huxley, let me now replace you in the line of Dickens, if I might, in your next one. I thank you, Teddy. Thank you for joining us. It is midnight in London, and we are all grateful to you for having come here. This is Double Blind. I truly can't praise it or the writing that constitutes it too highly. It is a book that will astound and astonish and delight and move anyone who cares for the English language. Thank you for joining us, and as my grandmother would say, feel better. Feel better.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Adam.
Bless you. Speak soon. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.